and Professor Diana Eck, who's a professor of comparative religion and Indian studies at Harvard. Lynn Cheney is from Wyoming, where she went to high school, but she went to college next door in Colorado College, and then got her doctorate in English literature at the University of Wisconsin. She is now chairman, as I said, of the National Endowment for the Humanities. This endowment does not have the biggest budget in the federal government, but it is one of the most important and also, I think, one of the trickiest jobs that there is in Washington. One of the most important because I think our civilization will be judged by how it cares for and how it adds to the humanities more than by anything else, except possibly perhaps for our politics, our political system. And it's one of the trickiest because of the variety of constituencies that she has to serve or please, and the difficulty of establishing a nonpartisan policy for promoting the humanities in a partisan environment. Ms. Cheney has recently authored a very important study on the core curriculum called 50 Hours, a core curriculum for college students. Her subject tonight is, and as someone said, this could go on for hours, but we'll keep within the usual bounds. What undergraduates don't know. Lynn Cheney.
Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction. It is interesting to hear Wyoming made to sound like such an exotic place. We always thought of Harvard as being the exotic locale. It is a pleasure to be here tonight at a gathering sponsored by so many distinguished groups: the Kennedy School, the School of Education, the Program for Constitutional Government. It is a pleasure to be in an event sponsored by such a distinguished assembly, since I probably don't have to begin my speech in the way that I usually do, and that's explaining what the humanities are. This is the subject of some mystery. I find that when I travel the country, and I find it indeed even when I stay in my office and read my mail. I got a letter not long ago addressed to the Natural Endowment for the Humanities, which has a certain woodsy charm about it. But my favorite misaddressed envelope was a card sent to me recently at the National Endowment for the Amenities. Now, that really is a pretty interesting slip, because while it's mostly an error, there is a hint of truth in it, and there is indeed pleasure in disciplines that comprise the humanities. The subjects of history and literature and philosophy have, through many centuries, been a source of satisfaction to human beings. St. Augustine once said, in fact, that the only reason to philosophize was in order to be happy. 20th century philosopher Charles Frankel explained the joy that the humanities can bring by noting the difference that people's experience has, the different quality it has, if they can bring the humanities, knowledge of the humanities to it. If they know the background, is how he put it, of what is happening to them. If they can place what they are doing in deeper and broader context. If they have the metaphors and symbols that can give experience a shape. He went on to use a metaphor himself, a homely one, to make the point. Think of what the lore and legend, the analyses and arguments that surround baseball contribute to our enjoyment of the game, he wrote. They make the game, as anyone can discover by sitting next to someone who is uninitiated. The humanities, Frankel argued, with myth, story, and debate, initiate us into life. And they're valuable not only to us as individuals, but as members of a polity. Knowledge of the ideas that have molded us and the ideals that have mattered to us function as a kind of civic glue. Our history and our literature give us symbols to share. They help us all no matter how diverse our backgrounds, feel as though we're part of a common undertaking. A story that illustrates this better than almost any other I know comes from a woman named Mary Anton, who came to this country as a small child from Russia. She wrote a book, an autobiography called The Promised Land, in which she talked about going to school in the United States and learning for the very first time, hearing for the very first time about this person called George Washington, this man who had been revered above all others, honored above all other men in his lifetime. And she wrote, "I discovered that I was more nobly related than I had ever supposed. George Washington was like a king in greatness, and he and I were fellow citizens." So communicating to the next generation the figures and ideas and events of the past is for many reasons a deeply important task. And how well are we accomplishing it? Well, certainly not as well as we should, according to a Gallup survey that the endowment funded recently. 25% of the nation's college seniors were unable to locate Columbus' voyage within the correct half-century. This is on a multiple-choice examination, you understand, and the choices aren't hard. No attempt to mislead or to trick the people being quizzed. About the same percentage, about a quarter, couldn't distinguish Churchill's words from Stalin's. They thought that Stalin was the person who had talked about the Iron Curtain descending across Europe. They thought it was Stalin who had talked about blood, toil, sweat, and tears. About the same percentage couldn't distinguish Karl Marx's, one of his favorite phrases, from each according to his need to each according to his ability. About 25% couldn't distinguish that phrase from the words of the United States Constitution. More than 40% couldn't say when the Civil War occurred. Most could not identify Magna Carta, the Missouri Compromise, Reconstruction. Most could not link major works by Plato, Dante, Shakespeare, Milton with their authors. The majority of college seniors, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from a Birmingham Jail were clearly unfamiliar. And it's not only in the humanities that college seniors have recently been found wanting. The National Science Foundation recently sent a film crew here to Harvard's graduation. They asked the bright, fresh-faced graduates in their caps and gowns to explain why it is that we have seasons. Now, all the graduates in this film answered the question with impressive authority and complete inaccuracy. Most of them explained quite self-confidently that we have winter because the Earth is farther from the sun then. Now, even if you don't know the right answer to the question, you can quickly figure out that this one doesn't work. If the Earth being farther from the sun is the determining factor, then why isn't it winter everywhere at once? In Canberra, for example, as well as here in Cambridge. It is also important to note that college seniors' lack of basic knowledge in important areas of human thought is not simply the result of the last 4 years of their education. It's not simply the fault of our colleges and universities. The National Endowment for the Humanities Gallup survey, like the National Science Foundation's film, are the results of 16 years of education, not just the last 4. Still, it is possible to look at our nation's campuses and see part of the reason why we have college seniors who can't tell Churchill from Stalin, or a good scientific explanation from a bad one. Students can graduate from 80% of our nation's colleges and universities without ever taking a course in the history of Western civilization. They can earn a bachelor's degree from 38% without ever taking any course in history, 45% without taking a course in American or English literature, 41% without studying mathematics, and that indeed is the case here at Harvard, 33% without studying natural and physical sciences. In the report issued by the endowment, along with the Gallup survey, we recommended a required course of studies, a core of learning, to ensure that undergraduates have opportunities to explore in broad-ranging, ordered, and coherent ways the major fields of human inquiry. This core, we suggested, might comprise about 40% of the curriculum, or 50 hours, a figure that falls well within the range of what most schools require in general education courses. But as it is now, the general education credits that could be organized into a coherent core are all too often instead organized into loosely stated distribution requirements. Mandates as students take some courses in some areas and some in others. Long lists of acceptable choices are set out in catalogs. Specialized offerings for the most part, they often have very little to do with the broadly conceived learning that should be at the heart of general education. Indeed, some courses seem to have very little to do with the areas of human knowledge that they're supposed to elucidate. At a public university in the West, it is possible to fulfill humanities requirements with courses in interior design. In 1989, at a private university in the East, one could fulfill part of the social science distribution requirement by taking lifetime fitness. At a Midwestern university, students can choose from almost 900 courses with topics ranging from the history of foreign labor movements to the analysis of daytime soap operas. The result, in naturalist Lauren Isley's words, is all too often a meaningless mosaic of fragments. From ape skull to Mayan temple, he wrote, we contemplate the miscellaneous debris of time like sightseers to whom these mighty fragments, fallen gateways and sunken galleys, convey no present instruction. The core of learning can show the patterns of the mosaic, taking what Cardinal Newman called a connected view of the old and new, past and present, far and near. A core can provide a context for forming the parts of education into a whole. In 50 Hours, we talked about many colleges and universities that have established cores of learning, and they can be found in every part of the country. And although their numbers are still few, they are growing. Still, the pace of change is remarkably slow, and no doubt that is in part because the task is hard. To design a rigorous and coherent program for general education is to answer the question, what should an educated person know? And that is a challenging question indeed. Moreover, we have found what seems an intellectually respectable way of avoiding the matter. We say, what is important is not what a person knows in various fields, but whether he or she understands the methods of inquiry used. Knowledge is not the issue, we say, but approaches to knowledge, a phrase from the Harvard College Catalog's description of the courses that this institution designates as a core curriculum. Now, there has been debate about Harvard's core since its inception, and no doubt those of you in this room know the terms of that debate better than I. Critics argue that no matter how good the courses, and what Harvard calls its core, no matter how fine the faculty members teaching the courses, taken all together, the offerings do not provide the connected view that Newman talked about. The courses are a miscellaneous assemblage rather than a coherent framework for learning. You can satisfy history requirements by studying the Cuban Revolution or tuberculosis in the 19th and 20th century. You can satisfy literature requirements by studying Shakespeare, the later plays, or by studying beast literature. The argument on the other side has been that Harvard does not, as the catalog puts it, define intellectual breadth as the mastery of a set of great books or the digestion of a specific quantum of information or the surveying of current knowledge in certain fields. Instead, and I quote again, Harvard seeks to introduce students to the major approaches to knowledge in areas that the faculty considers indispensable to undergraduate education. Now, Harvard is not alone in its allegiance to this idea. It can be found at many institutions of higher education and at other levels as well. Indeed, a focus on the process of knowing rather than on knowledge itself so permeates our nation's elementary and secondary school systems that the content of education sometimes seems in danger of being entirely ignored. Basal readers, the books that are developed for children in the early grades to teach them how to read. These books are developed with the idea of teaching approaches to knowledge. The aim is not to present a rich and well-considered array of literature to children, but to teach mental skills, such as how to identify the sequential order of events, such as how to follow directions involving sub-steps. A whole literature is written to teach these skills. One mental skill particularly stressed in basal readers is how to find the main idea, which is an aptitude we would all want our children to have. In looking through basal readers, however, I find many times that there are pages in which children are instructed to find the main idea, but in this prose artificially constructed to teach that skill, there is no main idea worth finding. It does seem to me that this is an example of the difficulty of trying to teach skills without paying sufficient attention to content. Another extreme manifestation of this syndrome can be seen at education conventions, where publishers fill the convention halls with display racks of books promising to teach higher order thinking skills, promising to teach how to think. Now, these books are not quite content-free, but they come as close as possible. Their mainstays are exercises in seeing analogies. Is a triangle more like a human being or a wheelbarrow? Meanwhile, looming over our educational landscape is the scholastic aptitude test, an examination that in its verbal component studiously avoids assessing substantive knowledge. Whether test takers have studied the Civil War or Magna Carta or read Macbeth are matters to which the SAT is supremely indifferent. The emphasis is on developed ability. And the emphasis that the SAT puts on developed ability, as opposed to knowledge, makes this test unique among those used by industrialized nations. When the British or French or Germans or Japanese set out to assess students finishing secondary education, they test, rather sensibly it seems to me, for what their students have learned. One more instance of the elevation of process over content, this one from higher education, can be found in what have come to be known as Discourse Studies, an approach to knowledge that has been enormously influential in literature and in other disciplines as well. What counts most in such teaching and research is not what, not the what. The subject can be anything, poem, play, bumper sticker. What counts is the how. How is this text, seemingly innocent, implicated in ideology? How can it be unmasked? At the University of Minnesota, the Humanities Department is currently proposing to abolish its chronologically organized Western civilization sequences and substitute 3 new courses. 1, Discourse and Society, 2, Text and Context, and 3, Knowledge, Persuasion, and Power. In the old courses, the focus was on the works of Plato, Dante, Descartes, and Rousseau. In the new ones, the emphasis is on, and I quote, the ways that certain bodies of discourse come to cohere, to exercise persuasive power, and to be regarded as authoritative, while others are marginalized, ignored, or denigrated. Instead of focusing on the writings of poets like Wordsworth or novelists like Austen, the new courses emphasize, and again I quote, hegemony and counter-hegemony. Well, given the persuasiveness, hegemony perhaps I should say, of the view that ways of knowing have preeminence over knowledge, the time has come, let me suggest, for a thorough and thoughtful examination of this idea. Many questions might be asked, but let me begin the discussion by posing just 2. First, even if we posit that the various fields of human inquiry are at the highest levels of scholarship, characterized by differing approaches, is this a matter of any interest or use to undergraduates? I come at this question from literature, and I have to say that most undergraduates I have known, most people I have known who love plays and novels and poetry, are not interested in them as methods of discourse, but as sources of insight into their lives and into the human predicament. Why are we reading? Annie Dillard asked recently. Why are we reading if not in hope of beauty laid bare, life heightened, and its deepest mystery probed? There is satisfaction, of course, in seeing how language achieves beauty, heightening, and revelation. But it is the achievement itself that draws most people back time and again. A student here at Harvard, a student of Professor Robert Coles, recently described the value of literature this way. Coles quotes him in his new book. This is the student. When I have some big moral issue, some question to tackle, I try to remember what my folks have said, or imagine them in my situation, or even more these days, I think of characters from novels, like Jude Foley in Jude the Obscure, or Jack Burton in All the King's Men. There's a lot of me in them, or vice versa. I don't know how to put it, but they're voices, and they help me make choices. Why don't college professors teach that way? And many professors do, of course, including Robert Coles. But to the extent that we allow approaches to knowledge to distance us from knowledge itself, in this case from the novels themselves, shouldn't we ask whether we are serving our students well? Shouldn't we ask whether we are teaching them in ways likely to encourage them to find in the humanities the wisdom and solace that generations have found? My second question is this. When, throughout our system of education, we emphasize approaches to knowledge, what kind of young people, what kind of graduates are we likely to produce? If we assume that it is possible to teach processes of knowing without emphasizing knowledge itself, then I suppose we could hypothesize quick-witted, nimble-brained generations that, not knowing as much as they should, nevertheless have the ability to learn quickly. But it may also be the case that not knowing as much as one should severely hinders one's ability to learn at all, much less to learn quickly. Bernard Lewis, Princeton's distinguished professor of Islamic studies, told me recently of teaching a graduate seminar and finding that the students in it did not know what the Crusades were. Now, they had the modern meaning down, that a crusade is a cause, but no idea of the word's historical significance. This, it would seem to me, would be a rather great hindrance to students engaging in advanced study of Middle Eastern history. Lack of knowledge can be an obstacle to understanding the present as well as the past. A story in last Saturday's Washington Post was headlined, "East European Events Leave Busy American Teenagers Unmoved." It told of teachers across the United States trying to engage their students with the enormously dynamic and emotionally affecting, at least to the teachers, events that are occurring in Poland and Hungary and Germany and Czechoslovakia. And it told of those teachers repeatedly finding their students confused and indifferent. The students didn't have the historical context to understand the significance of changes in Eastern Europe and within the Soviet Union. As one teacher put it, they don't understand what communism is in the first place. So when you say it's the death of communism, they don't know what you're talking about. During a discussion in which East Bloc countries were referred to as satellites of the Soviet Union, one student raised her hand to ask, "I'm sorry, but what is this talk of satellites? Are we talking about satellites, dishes, or what?" The emphasis in our educational system on approaches to knowledge as opposed to knowledge itself is not the only culprit here. All of us in this room can think of many reasons why young people in this country do not know as much as they should. But surely the emphasis on process and the neglect of content that we can see at all levels of education is an important factor. If we do not emphasize that there are important figures and books and events that are important to know, then we shouldn't be surprised when young people don't know them. If we don't undertake the hard work of setting out a framework for learning, then we shouldn't be surprised when students don't have one and when they have difficulty making sense of new events. Concentrating on knowledge, concentrating on what should be taught and learned, as well as on ways of teaching and learning and knowing. It's not easy work, but it may be among the most worthwhile efforts that those of us concerned about education can undertake. The generations, Bernard of Chartres once observed, are like small figures seated on the shoulders of giants. His point was not to diminish the present and glorify the past, but to stress the enormous benefit to the present that knowledge of the past offers. By focusing on what is important to know and helping the next generation to learn it, we lift them up so that they can see, in Bernard of Chartres' words, like those small figures on the shoulders of giants, so that they can see more things than the ancients saw and see things more distant. I'd like to thank the Center for American Political Studies in particular for encouraging a broad range of discussion on issues affecting our national life.
First respondent will be Professor Arthur Levine.
That was a marvelous statement. It's a very hard statement to disagree with. Let me just try anyway. And say that there have been a lot of curriculum reports over the last several years. And I was reading one just the other day, and it said, one fact is becoming more and more obvious every day. The American public is not satisfied with the present course of education, and the great objection is that it's not sufficiently modern and comprehensive to meet the exigencies of the age and the country in which we live. The report went on to say that how in this age, in which we're much more involved with a global society, can we not be teaching foreign languages? It went on to say, how in this age, in which we're having a technological revolution, are we not teaching science? It went on to say that teaching is bad, students are basically ignorant, and that if colleges don't do something, we're going to develop institutions that will in their place. Now, that wasn't a document written by Lynn Cheney. That wasn't a document written by William Bennett, who preceded her. It was a document written by the faculty of Amherst, and they wrote it in 1827. The point I want to make is there's a danger, and it's not one that you alluded to. But the danger is that we view and look backward and think about the past as a golden age. But we've lost something very, very special. Once we offered education, that was very, very different. We don't do that anymore. We spent a long time trying to figure out when we lost the golden age. And Alan Bloom and William Bennett said we did it in the 60s. With a sense of cultural relativism. But you know what? Robert Hutchins, who was president of the University of Chicago, said that's not when it happened. It happened at the turn of the century with the rise of all kinds of professional schools and vocational schools. And you know what? Thorstein Veblen, the economist, said that wasn't when it happened. It happened after the Civil War with the rise of the free elective system. And you know what? The faculty of Yale in 1828 said that wasn't when it happened. It was contemporary reformers who cared too much about careers. And you know what? Cardinal Newman said it was John Locke and his peers. And you know what? Dionysius of Halicarnassus in 1st century BC said it was the Greeks for premature specialization. The reality is there never was a golden age. There never will be a golden age. Every generation comes with unique problems, unique opportunities, and very real kinds of issues we need to think about in terms of education. And you posed a lot of the issues. If I were to raise questions, I guess I'd raise 3. The first one is that as we've talked about the issue, the accent in our conversation has been on the notion of a core. A core is a method of offering general education. We have all kinds of methods of offering general education. We have cores, we have distribution requirements, some coherent and prescribed, some smorgasbord and loose. We have free electives, we have disciplines, we have interdisciplines, we have problem-centered kinds of approaches. The reality is if I've looked at general education programs around the country, every one of them can work and every one of them can fail, with the exception of free electives. Given that reality, my request would be that we let colleges choose the method of offering general education. let me talk about the substance of general education for just a moment and say that what we've been offered in 50 hours and also in this conversation is a list of subjects. But I think there's a larger issue. A list of subjects, most of which I agree with. I think they're useful things and appropriate to a curriculum. But I think a list of subjects gives us something for everybody to agree with and to disagree with. I think there's a larger issue, and it's one we don't agree about. And that's, what's the fundamental purpose of the humanities? What's the fundamental purpose of general education? About 6-7 years ago, Ernie Boyer and I looked at, Ernie Boyer is president of the Carnegie Foundation, and I looked at a series of general education programs around the country. We looked at the history of the movement, the ebb and flow, and we looked at 3 revivals in general education which occurred throughout the century, one after World War I, one after World War II, and the current revival. And what we found was rather fascinating to us. We found that general education reform, humanities reform, comes in times in which there's a real sense of meism in our society, a real sense of strong individualism, and periods in which the common social agenda seems frayed, uncertain. And in every revival, what general education and humanities have done have moved in the direction of community, bringing us together, away from social fragmentation, with a focus on shared values, shared responsibilities, shared governance, a shared heritage, and a global vision. In a very real sense, what I'm saying is the humanities reform movement is a mirror of larger trends in our society. So what do? What's the agenda for the humanities? I would say that it's those experiences, those relationships, those ethical concerns that are common to all of us by virtue of our living in a society at a particular moment in history. General education, the humanities, is an institutional affirmation of society's hold on each and every one of us. So if I were drawing up my list, our lists wouldn't be dramatically different. I would ask for some particular subjects because of the times. I would ask that we spend more time on a global perspective. I would ask that instead of a course on Western civilization and later courses on other civilizations, that we teach civilization. I would ask for more in the way of ethics and values as particular subject matters. My emphasis would be less disciplinary, more on the common bonds that all people share. I'd add one more point before closing. It's that, as we think about subject matters, before getting on to that point, I think we need to think about more than the subjects, but the shared vision that underlies all of this. Let us debate that, and after we've debated that and reached some sense of consensus, let us then talk about what subject matters. I've seen lots of subject matters taught rather poorly. By identifying the subject matters without the purpose underlying them, we've come not very far. I'd offer one other piece of analysis, and it's that general education reform, humanities reform, is a periodic event in our society. Every 30 years, we move from taking our humanities and general education requirements apart to putting them back together. Now, it's a useful thing to do. It amounts to the equivalent, I guess, of curricular molting. But what it really is that chance to take apart a curriculum that's become old and perhaps less useful and instill in its place something updated, vibrant, and alive. Henry Adams came to this institution in the mid-19th century, and he took a curriculum very much like that recommended in 50 hours. And his analysis of it was, he had an education which had been prepared in the 18th century, which he studied in the 19th century, and had to live in a world that was hurtling toward the 20th century. The danger for all of us is that we identify subject matters and neglect to provide the kinds of learning, the kinds of bodies of knowledge, the kinds of ways of knowing that we need to live in a world today. That's the danger. It's also the opportunity of general education reform. Thank you.
Now, Professor Diana Eck.
Thank you, Harvey. And thank you, Lynn Cheney. I guess I would begin my remarks by saying that I, too, was rather arrested by Harvey Mansfield's rather breathless uttering of the word Wyoming in his introduction. And having been brought up and gone to public school in Montana, I have a lot of sympathy with the kind of environment that Lynn Cheney speaks to, because I think of a great deal of what I do in the academic world in relation to my roots in Montana, roots that are still very living and vibrant with me. And I remember when I, as an undergraduate, decided that I would go to India for a year of study abroad. I went on my junior year of study in India and learned Hindi and discovered a whole subcontinent that I literally had known little about before. And I went home to Montana the next year, and people talked to me about how exotic it was that I was studying India. And wasn't this rather esoteric that I was studying this civilization that was so far out? This was sort of in the mid-'60s. And I remember thinking to myself, well, what do you mean, really? I mean, here is this subcontinent with more people than Latin America and Africa combined, with a history of 3,000 years of civilization that is as rich and complex as any that we can imagine. And my people in Montana are telling me that it's exotic. Montana, that has an established history after the Native American history of scarcely more than 150 years, maybe 200 at the most. This is the centennial of our statehood this year. And with scarcely any people, one of the least populous per square mile in the United States, telling me that to study India, this subcontinent that represents a fifth of humanity, is exotic. But I took it seriously, and I took it as a challenge that to me has remained one through my intellectual life, and that is to be able to communicate to people widespread, not simply to people in the university, what is of value in the things that we have discovered and found worthwhile in the academic world. And I think it's an important link. It certainly has been an important one in my own life and in my own teaching. One of the things that I think is important about what Lynn Cheney has presented to us is to take seriously the fact that we have a certain level of illiteracy, not simply through 4 years, but through 16 years of our educational life in the United States. I see this especially because a lot of what I teach is not simply in India, but in the comparative study of religion. And as you know, religion has been, until very recently, somewhat of a taboo subject in the public schools. It is constitutionally possible to teach about religion in the public schools, but we don't do very much of it. We're rather skittish about it. And as a result, the freshmen and sophomores whom I teach in my introductory courses in comparative religion have almost no background, not only in the traditions of the West, except insofar as they've gleaned it through history courses, but certainly in the traditions of the rest of humankind, with whom we do indeed share the planet and increasingly share our own neighborhoods as well. People simply didn't know until the time of the Ayatollah whether an imam was a person, place, or thing. They had no idea. And in a country where today part of our American heritage is the fact that there are coming to be as many Muslims in the United States as Jews, and are at the present time more Muslims than Episcopalians, for example. This is not simply part of what we need to know to understand people in the Middle East, but what we need to know to understand the plurality of our own culture. So the level of illiteracy simply about the facts of our world, so to speak, I do find astounding. And it's accentuated even more in the field of the academic study of religion, where we have, I think, rather a special weakness as American citizens. The question of approaches to or contents of knowledge is one that I think is perplexing. And I don't wish to be in the position of having to bear on my slender shoulders the weight of defending the whole of the Harvard core curriculum, though I was involved in the debates that led to the formulation of that curriculum. And I think that, in a way, what Harvard has come up with as a core, for even though there are places one can point to as weaknesses, is something of a balance between attempting to focus on what people should know and attempting to address the wider question of how it is we know the things we know. For example, in the historical studies requirement of the core, obviously it's not only a question of insisting that people know something about some substantial range of history, but maybe more importantly, to think about the issue of how to think historically about any problem. I think there is something of a balance between looking at a range of history and looking at approaches to thinking historically. That also is present in the requirement that there be some exposure to social analysis. As it's put in the introduction to social analysis in the core, to enhance our understanding of contemporary behavior. How is it that social analysis, that social forms of analysis serve us in thinking about what it is to think about whole societies psychologically, in terms of sociology, in terms of economics? It seems to me as well that the requirement for moral reasoning, that we insist that people know how to construct a moral argument and defend it, is something that legitimately we might request an educated person to know. And certainly the requirements of foreign cultures, I think those are not ones that you would argue with, because in a way your core curriculum has more foreign cultures than ours. And in that I really applaud it. I think the requirement that one have an entire year of exposure to foreign cultures is important. But the argument here was more, in an ideal world, we would like people to know about Africa, about Russia, about the People's Republic of China, about the history of South Asia, and about Latin America, to say nothing of Europe and the United States. But let's take the whole continents of foreign cultures. The purpose of that requirement is to enable people, at least for a short time, truly to stand in the shoes of another people, to look at the world through another set of eyes, and to begin to develop some critical perspective on the culture that we take for granted. Now, that in itself has some intellectual validity, whether you study Russia or whether you study India. And I'm not one to argue for everyone taking India over taking Russia or China and Japan. I think the other question that's involved in this is, well, of course, we don't really understand our own culture. Maybe it's important to study our own culture first. And I think there also is a strong argument made for that. But I guess my own experience in teaching foreign cultures has been that it is precisely in that dialogue, in enabling students to take another perspective and to look deeply at another culture, that they're really able to raise questions about their own and to see their own in a new set of eyes. I think in my own course, it's the section that we do on the caste system that perhaps throws this most uniquely into perspective. Because all of us assume, because it says so in the Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal. On the other hand, we're not quite sure what that means until we look at a society in which that is not an assumption. And I think a book like Louis Dumont's Homo Hierarchicus, which is a study of the caste system, enables undergraduates to see what it is that we presuppose in human equality more clearly than if they simply read de Tocqueville and the sort of founders of American civil thought without having them called into question by a very different form of thought. So in a sense, it's a philosophy of education that's based on the notion that we not only need to understand the other, but in a way we need the other in order to understand ourselves. I think that is built into our core requirement and remarkably into the 50 hours that has has come out from the National Endowment of Humanities. I was really impressed with the 50 hours curriculum. I mean, I myself feel a kind of tension between the way we've constructed it and wrestled with it and the way that you've constructed it. I will say one thing, though, that I think the process of curricular reform, and this you've alluded to as well, Arthur, is a very important process for a faculty. And of all the things that the core curriculum has generated at Harvard, one of the things that it's generated is a faculty that thinks about these questions and that's divided into subcommittees to examine what it is that might meet our understanding of an historical studies course or a foreign cultures course, to think about curriculum and education, not just in general, but in particulars, as embodied in particular courses. And both the process of thinking through the core in its inception and rethinking it on the monthly basis as these core committees meet in the faculty club over lunch, month after month throughout the academic year, is part of the academic responsibility of the faculty. And I can't help but think it's been immensely generative in a way that the old general education requirement at Harvard as a distribution requirement wasn't, because it demands an ongoing participation of the faculty. And I think that one of the most important issues is the issue that Lynn Cheney raises so dramatically in many of her works. Where are we going to get the faculty to teach these broad-ranging American civilization, Western civilization, foreign cultures courses when we're training graduate students to be specialists in such narrow ways? And perhaps in addition to rethinking our training of graduate students, one of the things that we attempt to do as faculties to remedy the situation is to rethink these matters in the process of articulating educational reform and keeping at it in faculty committees. I think one of the ways in which my own breadth of knowledge and of sort of interdisciplinary questioning has grown in the university is precisely through the committees that the core has generated. But I hate to see an undergraduate curriculum reform meant for undergraduates ending up benefiting the faculty. I do think that it's one of the things that has happened. With those few remarks, thank you very much. It's been very educational.
Well, I guess I would most like to hear from the audience, but just a few quick remarks. You forgot my favorite description of curriculum, which was John Milton's in the 1600s. He called the British curriculum a bag of sow thistles and brambles. Your point in bringing up all of these descriptions was that there never was a golden age. I call this the there never was a golden age straw person. Because most people that I know who are involved in this debate never really argue that, though it is sort of a nice thing to bring up in the course of debate. When was Henry Adams here at Harvard?
1840.
Well, see, now let's just assume it was the 1850s. The reason Henry Adams had such a bad experience is that the curriculum reform in the 1845 Red Book was never put into effect. Was a curriculum reform.
1945.
Oh. Well, Henry would have been better off if he had been able to have the Red Book put into effect. All right, well, you got me on that one. Let's see if I can come up with one you can't. Here's a statistic for both of you. In the recent Gallup survey, 12% of the undergraduates surveyed thought that the Quran was a sacred text of Islam. I'm sorry, 12%. No, 62% thought it was a sacred text of Islam. 12% thought it was a sacred text of Judaism. Now, that's the Islam is a lot bigger than the Judaism, but that's a remarkable confusion about a tradition. I bring that up simply because I get nervous when I hear talk about we're going to teach something called civilization. I heard a speaker once talk about how we were going to teach the inchoate planetary culture. And that worries me, just like talk about civilization does. There are traditions, and it seems to me that part of what education is about is teaching those. You called the Harvard core a balance between what and how. I just note in closing and look forward to questions from the audience that the Confi Guide calls it the worst of both worlds.
If you want to ask a question, please make your way to one of these two microphones.
Well, we can hear you.
Earlier than the undergraduate curriculum, but are back in the secondary or even the primary curriculum. And I would like to ask, to what extent the real root of the problem here is the low status that the society places on teaching compared to much more dubious professions such as leveraged buyouts and arms merchants and other things that provide a lot less benefit to society than the teaching of humanities.
It's a very good point. I mean, a lot of the problem is in elementary and secondary education, but the problem is so severe that my theory is we need to proceed on all fronts at once. We are now preparing the teachers of tomorrow in our colleges and universities. They've come to our colleges and universities not knowing basic landmarks of human thought, and they're going to leave our colleges and universities not knowing basic landmarks of human thought. So it seems to me this is a severe cultural problem that moves throughout our education system. You're right, teachers are not valued as much as they should be. But part of the problem is what Professor Eck was talking about. They're not valued as much as they should be in higher education. One of the problems with getting courses in general education is that there is no reward for developing them. There's no reward for teaching them. We've tried to go some way to remedy this at the endowment by setting up a program to help colleges and universities establish distinguished teaching chairs. Chairs that will go to people who are involved in curricular reform and in teaching of undergraduates. You're right, that's an enormous problem, but like many problems, it is, I think, a top-down problem. You have colleges and universities that won't establish priorities about what it's important to know. The schools don't think it's important to establish priorities about what it's important to know. We have teaching undervalued in higher education. I think it is inevitable that it will become devalued throughout the system as a whole.
From MIT, and sweaters I give to my girlfriend who got her degree at the School of Ed. I'm a little confused because I don't understand how it's possible that if a person learns how to learn more quickly, they're going to avoid knowing more. And that if what we do is we teach the process of learning what is relevant, aren't we going to educate in the long run a better class of citizen and a better class of student? Second thing is that there seems to be an emphasis on historical perspective, but it appears to me that what we really have to do in education is teach futuristic thinking rather than historical thinking. We somehow have to be able to cope with the future. The past will be recapitulated by various authorities, but it doesn't impact us quite as much as the future will. And I think that's especially true in social issues and social problems, because and economic ones as they impact on social issues, because it appears that we're entering an economy where we can overproduce and somehow have to cope with overproduction, the ability of a very small population to produce all the sort of useful tools, the food, the refrigerators, the Nintendo games for the entire population.
Question, I hope.
So I guess in the end, I go back to the original question, which is, isn't the process more important than a body of knowledge? Aren't we better off in the long run?
I think that one's to you.
I actually had set up my own straw person, which was the viewpoint that emphasizing process at the expense of content produces a group of people who can learn how to learn quickly. I frankly don't believe that's true, and I maybe didn't make that transition clear enough in the speech. Let me just say one thing about MIT that may get to your point. Relevance is not always easy to define. You're talking about our need to focus on the future as being more relevant than the past. I will note that MIT just underwent a significant curricular reform and, in fact, increased significantly the number of hours required in the humanities. And when asked why they had done this, the PR person for this school said something wonderful. She said, well, you know, too many of our graduates were going to work for graduates from Yale and Dartmouth. It's very interesting. The point being that historical perspective was somehow a crucial key to leadership, somehow providing the kind of judgment and perspective that one might not get studying purely technological subjects and trying to understand a future without knowing the tradition out of which it's evolved. I hate to say Yale again, but Jaroslav Pelikan has a wonderful phrase. He talks about, and he's from Yale, of course, he talks about the future being not a standing broad jump from where we are now into the future. It's a running broad jump through a path that guides us into the future. It's a nice way to think about how that historical perspective is tied up with what comes next.
Completed this summer Sloan program. They have a school of management at MIT too.
They force you to take all those humanities courses.
Yeah, they did. Actually, it was mostly humanities. There was primarily jokes about Harvard and Yale, but we did use some Yale materials in it. The one thing that was impressed is that basically when managers come in from Yale, they don't understand anything. They come in, they look around, so that people from MIT can feel secure that they're in control of most of the technology and most of the apparatus, even though people from Yale like to think that they are.
Thank you.
Yeah, I read in a recent issue of the Washington Monthly a series critiques that go something like we've heard tonight in this debate. And one of the major points of the article, I'm not really sure on who wrote the article, who wrote what part, and how great a magazine it is, so we'll leave that to the floor. But the main points was that Harvard's core is so convoluted because of campus politics, that each professor doesn't like to feel worthless or valueless, that little piece of work he or she has spent his or her time working on, dissertation or higher studies, is very important. And so you have a core where you can study just about anything, when who knows if it's really important. It's purely out of pride and campus politics. I'd like to hear what you think about that.
I think that sounds like a good question for Professor Ed.
You'd be surprised to know that there are courses that are turned down for the core. And in fact, after a great deal of discussion, and it is a difficult issue. I mean, courses are sent back to distinguished professors to be rewritten. There are instances that the professor change his or her course outline or policies concerning teaching fellows or grading or anything. So I don't think that it's entirely a matter of campus politics or nurturing the egos of professors who have spent their lives focusing on rather small matters and insisting that they're important enough to go into the core. I do think that the question of what constitutes a canon, which is one that is raised a great deal in all sorts of circles these days, is one that is certainly discussed a great deal in different departments in the university, and on which there's a great deal of disagreement. And it's not surprising that some of that disagreement comes into the focus of discussion on courses that are in or not in the core curriculum. And that is another sort of angle of the question that I think sharpens the issue of that takes place when professors are actually planning courses. And that is the practical question of, in the course of a semester of some 13 weeks or so, perhaps can have students read, even Harvard students, read 12 full books. And if one is to decide which 12 books they're to read in Western civilization, or in Indian civilization, or in Chinese civilization, how do you make that decision? Who makes that decision? On what grounds do they make that decision? And I think that really is the shape of the question as it comes into the Harvard curriculum. And maybe if I could throw that one your direction, I think it's one that makes the issue of the what as opposed to the process perhaps clearer, because I experience that issue as someone who teaches both the what and the how. What is it that I want students to read in a semester of studying 3,000 years of Indian civilization? And how do I make that decision? You don't have to answer it at the beginning,
no,
but
one of the points of this, one of the points of 50 hours, is that people who have studied these things, who have knowledge and experience, and one would hope wisdom on these matters, make that is the person who should make these decisions, as opposed to undergraduates who simply haven't the experience to do these things. I just want to answer your other question. Charlie Peters edits Washington Monthly. This is a fine magazine. Partly it's a fine magazine because Charlie Peters went to Columbia and had the benefit of very fine core curriculum. I would suggest that this no doubt lent some bias to this particular article you're talking about.
Let me pick up your point and agree with you. I like Washington Monthly a lot. But the more important point is this. I tried to get out as soon as possible. The third thing that happened was students hated it. The end result also wasn't funded. At some point, the history department refused to participate in Western civilization, which gives some sense of the quality of the program. It's working against a lot of issues at most schools, varying from incentives to training to interests of all the participants. But there are two other issues I'd throw in. One other issue is that we tend to trivialize it. It's really easy to turn the humanities into a collection of odd facts that make for cocktail party chit-chat. One of the things that I have to confess, my definition for why there are seasons just proved to be wrong. Let me ask around the room. How many got it right? Just let me see a sea of hands. How many of you know why there are seasons? We didn't get a majority here. These are people who are fairly functional. There must be some reason behind general education other than knowing when wars occurred, other than knowing what religion reads what text. There's got to be something larger and something more important. And on campuses all across the country, we haven't found that to be true. And that in a lot of ways diminishes the quality.
Let me just add, the student's point was so well taken that there aren't any rewards in teaching general education. There aren't any rewards in devising the courses. And Columbia itself, Carol Gluck, who directs general education there, is quite frank in admitting that the salvation of general education lies in changing academic culture so that teaching is valued. And you talked about trivializing the core. Let me just ask the audience a question. I had a Harvard student tell me tonight that the way you find out how easy someone's semester load is by asking the following question. How many cores are you taking? And if the answer is more than one, this means that the student has an easy go of it. Is this fair? Is this true? Well, it sounds as... I love it. Okay, let's hear this question.
They are going to be tough. The core courses are not going to be quite rigorous. If the course of physics, you got to keep colors as well as physics. So why is that so terrible?
Well, it just sounds as though the core is trivialized, was the word that is used, that the assignments aren't rigorous enough, the lectures aren't necessary enough. The conversation went on, and I was regaled with tales of the necessity of not going to lectures, being able to purchase lecture notes. This does not sound to me like education's finest hour, whether it is in general education or the major. I mean, I don't know if this is true. I'm asking a question.
Since I teach a course in the core, I don't think it's certainly not true of my course. But on the other hand, there are in the core curriculum, as probably in departments in general, some courses that are regarded as easy and some that are regarded as tough. And students make that knowledge known to one another. But I think the most interesting sort of gauge of the success of the core in terms of the intellectual life of Harvard, it addresses your point, Arthur, which is that professors actually have a very high quotient of satisfaction teaching in the core. They really enjoy teaching in the core. And professors who never would have given a gen ed course or wouldn't want to give something that was in the old general education curriculum actually sort of submit their course to the core with sweaty palms and find that that experience of teaching in the core more or less satisfying. So it seems to me that there's a level of faculty engagement with the core that is something that's worth taking into account. And it also is hard to generalize in some way about the core, because some courses are great big courses with 300 or 400 people, and some courses are rather intimate courses with only 15 or 20. So it's a multi-shaped beast that we're talking about.
Which are the easy ones and which are the hard ones?
Yeah, that's the question.
Over here.
I have a two-part question for Ms. Cheney. First, I took, I read Locke and Darwin and Augustine at high school and took several good classes in history, or world history, European history. Why can't your proposals be directed more toward high schools and have a more analytical for colleges, which I think would be more suitable? And secondly, I have several friends at the University of Chicago, which I suppose is probably close to your ideal for a core program. And they many of them have felt quite disjointed at the end of it, that they don't feel as if they've had an integrated experience. And I mean, should we worry if in such a turbulent and ever-changing world, people do feel too settled with their general education?
They feel too what?
Too settled with their general education.
Well, one of my favorite statements on the whole matter of being settled about general education comes from a woman named Ethel Wolff, who is the guru of the core curriculum at Brooklyn College, and she's a classicist. So she puts it this way. She says, the unexamined curriculum is not worth teaching. This is a nice point, and it's absolutely true, and it's why I'm not dismayed that people have criticized curricula forever. That is a very healthy process, as is developing them. I'm happy always to run into someone whose high school preparation has been such that you don't come to college with great gaps in knowledge, but that's not typical. And I argue that a core will not be detrimental to people like yourself, that it will not damage your character to read the Federalist Papers twice.
I'm not saying that, but why shouldn't that be more typical?
My point is that we should, as I put it, intervene in all fronts at once. Yes, of course, we need to strengthen teaching curriculum in our elementary and secondary schools. But meanwhile, what are we supposed to do? Keep turning out generations of people on the world who don't know when Columbus sailed?
I was just suggesting why don't we have more canonically based core curriculum for high schools and more analytical ones?
In fact, that's the European pattern. I think that it's not simply a matter of setting a curriculum in place that would make sure that everyone who's graduated from high school had covered all of the intellectual bases, so to speak. It would be also a matter of our being willing to put in place of the SAT some content-based, curriculum-based examination, so that our high schools, our secondary schools in particular, would focus on what young people should know. Richard Rorty has a wonderful description of how conservatives and liberals feel about this, and in some ways, though Rorty happens to be at the other end of the spectrum for me on that, I have some sympathy with what he talks about. He says liberals think that this core learning all ought to go in the schools, and colleges ought to be a place where professors can display their wares and the students can select from the boutiques. If indeed our high schools did produce graduates who could pass the baccalaureate, who could pass it's the one in Germany, the Terminal. I can't remember the names. But in any case, if we could do that, then perhaps a core would not be necessary.
Question over here.
Yes, I would like it if Dr. Levine and Dr. Cheney would further elaborate on their notions of civilization and world civilization and Western civilization and how they play into the notion of knowledge and what knowledge is relevant, and whether Eurocentrism is a way in which the world should be examined solely, or whether there should be a multicultural or a view which embraces a larger body of knowledge which not only examines the world from a European perspective, but from the perspective of others as well, of various ancestral backgrounds. Thank you.
I'm not for Eurocentrism, are you?
But
all of the people, or many of the people who were cited today, have been of European descent, and which is not to invalidate the significance of their contributions, but it seems as if the model that's being presented is somewhat unidimensional. And I was wondering if Dr. Levine could talk a little bit more about what he meant by civilization, and if you could also speak more about the notion of world civilization and where the contradictions arise between the two of you.
That's a good question. You want to go first? I think the chief difference between us, though, I mean, we've had 2 minutes to figure this out, is a respect for tradition. And, I guess I'm heavy on the tradition idea, and maybe you're a little bit lighter on it. And not just Western tradition, but the tradition of Islam, the tradition of China, of Japan, of African civilizations and cultures, of Latin American civilizations and cultures. The idea being that it's very important to understand the thing in and of itself, and not simply to understand a little piece of it that happens to fit into our perspective, whatever it is. And so what 50 Hours recommends is a study of Western civilization, and it argues that that's very important since that's where we live and it's a political heritage we all share. And it also argues for the study of American civilization, which is an interesting extension of the West, bringing people of diverse cultures into important roles. And also study of some of those not considered above, I think is the way we put it. What do you call Latin America? I mean, it's not the West, but it's sort of not in our traditional concept of the West, though perhaps it should be, and that may be our failure. But in any case, Latin America will be on the list.
Tends to be east-west, and I think you're talking about north-south. I might use that as an illustration.
Yeah, we don't know how to talk about Latin America because we tend to think east-west. That's a good point.
And I think the only respect in which we differ is this. I think that the differentiation of civilizations is not a good thing. I think that the Western civilization course is something that comes down to us from a time in which our whole relationship was a relationship with Western Europe for the most part. And what's happened now is, as we look at the globalization of society, it becomes increasingly important that we look east as well as west, that course not be separated, that the great thinkers and great classics, we both believe in tradition. And I guess what I'm arguing is that traditions come from many different cultures, and all those aren't Western. I think to the extent that we're capable of integrating that non-Western course and that Western course, we will move a step beyond the two different courses. One of the things that terribly frightens me is if one reads Alan Bloom. Alan Bloom is very clear in saying that Western civilization is what we ought to study because it includes the great ideas. The great ideas are not non-Western. That's a real danger. And to the extent that we separate one course from the other, what we do is we, in many ways, fail to see the development of civilization as occurred. I'm troubled by the alternative that you offered me before, which was when I suggested civilizations, you described an esoteric curriculum. a curriculum that was,
An inchoate planetary culture. That's what I said.
that seems esoteric to me. I think there are other alternatives. I think that that's what we call a slippery slope. And we've got all the way down to the bottom of the slope on that argument. I think it's possible to put those courses together and come up with something that's very coherent and is not our interplanetary look at these kinds of issues.
I got my cards on the table. Let's see your curriculum. You know, I want to see Plato and the Republic and Sundiata and Dream of the Red Chamber and the Bhagavad Gita. I want to see those all in a single course and see how you do that and make it respect the thing in and of itself as well as its greatness.
And you got a little bit of an edge on me. I don't think anybody has to produce 50 hours in 2 minutes.
Next time I see you.
Question over here. This is our last question.
I'm a junior at Harvard, and I'm firmly in support of foreign cultures and studying foreign languages, etc. The only problem is I had a strong humanities high school education at a preparatory high school, and I've gone through most of my core curriculum requirements here, and so I really can't see that as a real way to really engross myself further from what I've already learned in high school in terms of humanities. So I looked to my concentration, which I was forced to choose at the end of freshman year. And I've been through the interdisciplinary concentrations, the selected ones here, social studies, history and literature. And I really couldn't see either of those as providing a strong humanities, I know it's not a good term, but even Western civilization focus or improvement over what I'd already attained. And my real question is, I know I have friends at Yale. There's a major there called Humanities, which seems to have what I think I would want. But I'd just like to know why Harvard doesn't seem to offer a similar concentration. I'm all for foreign cultures, etc., but why doesn't it offer a humanities major where I could learn about that?
Now, the program at Yale that interests me is one that's called Directed Studies. It just seems so promising to me. It provides that core experience at a very sophisticated level for students who want it. And this is, of course, one of the possibilities we point out in 50 hours. It may be that a core for every student at some universities won't work, but that there be within the institution some possibility for this kind of guided, directed studies that would be at a sufficiently advanced level seems important.
That's only for freshmen. That ends freshman year.
Well, some of these programs do have an elitist bias to them. Honors programs typically do. I can't answer for Harvard.
I've really been addressing it to the Harvard professors, I guess.
You could major in the comparative study of religion if you've tried. I mean, it really is an interdisciplinary humanities major that is both East and West, and that engages arts, literature, history, and social structure. But no, we don't have a humanities major per se. I mean, there are several interdisciplinary majors that sort of verge on breadth in the humanities, but nothing quite so broad. You can do a special concentration if you put it together and make a good intellectual argument.
I've tried to do that, but it seems very difficult to do.
It is hard.
It's uphill battle.
Well, this has been useful just to bring this to the point of people who have influence in the core committee. Let me just, with a closing comment, I had a faculty member at Harvard tell me that the reason you don't have a math requirement is that calculus was considered to be too hard for most students, and because you are Harvard, you couldn't do anything less than calculus. I offer this story to you as a compliment. When we sit and talk about your core, people like me come and offer critical assessments of it. It really is a compliment in the sense that because you are Harvard, people pay very close attention to what you do. So those of us involved in education reform are always encouraging you to be your best selves.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Cheney, for that backhanded compliment. Only to be expected from someone who works for a man from Yale. But we're very glad to have you, and we close the meeting and thank our speakers.